I've spent a lot of time trying different productivity apps, and I think one of the biggest things I've learned is that most of them solve the wrong problem. On the surface, they look useful. They give you a place to track habits, organize tasks, set routines, and feel like you're doing something productive. And to be fair, that can help in the beginning. There's usually a little burst of motivation when you first start. You feel more in control, more hopeful, maybe even more disciplined for a few days. But what I kept noticing over and over again was that the structure itself wasn't enough. A clean interface, a checklist, a streak, a reminder, none of that automatically creates consistency. It might help for a moment, but it doesn't necessarily help you understand why some days you stay on track and other days everything falls apart. That's the gap I kept running into. I think a lot of people assume the problem is laziness or lack of discipline, and sometimes maybe that's part of it. But most of the time, I think the real issue is that people are trying to improve without really understanding their own behavior. They know what they want to do, but they don't fully understand the patterns that keep pushing them away from it. They don't know what makes a habit feel natural one week and impossible the next. They don't always notice how energy, stress, mood, context, and routine all shape consistency. That's why I started caring less about productivity as performance and more about productivity as awareness. I stopped looking for tools that simply helped me record things, and I started looking for something that could help me reflect. Something that made me feel more connected to what I was doing and why I was doing it. Something that didn't just turn life into a system of boxes to check. And that's really where Modigrad started standing out to me. What I like about it is that it doesn't feel like it was built only to push you harder. It feels like it was built to help you understand yourself a little better while you're trying to improve. That difference matters a lot. Because there's a big gap between an app that pressures you to be productive and an app that helps you recognize your own patterns. One creates guilt when you fall off. The other creates clarity. And I think clarity is way more useful in the long run. For example, if you miss a few days with a habit, most apps basically leave you with a gap, a broken streak, or maybe a reminder that you failed to keep up. But that alone doesn't teach you much. It doesn't help you ask better questions. What changed that week? Was your schedule different? Were you more mentally drained? Did the habit become too ambitious? Were you relying too much on motivation instead of rhythm? That kind of reflection is where real adjustment starts. And without adjustment, people often just repeat the same cycle. Start strong, lose momentum, feel bad, restart, repeat. That cycle is exhausting. And I think a lot of people quietly live in it for years. That's one of the reasons I connect more with the idea behind Modigrad. It feels like it respects the fact that progress is messy. It doesn't pretend that building better habits is just about trying harder. It seems to understand that consistency is not a straight line and that meaningful growth comes from awareness, not just effort. Another thing I appreciate is that it makes productivity feel less mechanical. A lot of apps reduce everything to output. Did you do it or not? Did you complete the task or not? Did you maintain the streak or not? But real life doesn't feel that simple. Sometimes progress is visible, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you're improving internally before it shows externally. Sometimes the most important thing isn't that you did everything perfectly, it's that you noticed what made things harder and responded better the next time. That's a much more human way of thinking about progress. And honestly, I think people stay with tools longer when those tools feel human. Not soft in a vague way, and not fake positive, but genuinely useful in a realistic way. A tool should make your life clearer, not just busier. It should help you think better, not only manage more. And for me, that's part of why Modigrad feels more meaningful than a lot of other productivity apps I've tried. It also changes the emotional relationship you have with productivity. When everything is built around pressure, numbers, and streaks, it's easy to start feeling like your worth is tied to how perfectly you perform. Miss a few days and suddenly it feels like you're failing. But when a tool helps you reflect instead of just judge, the whole experience becomes healthier. You're not only measuring yourself, you're learning from yourself. That's a much better foundation for sustainable progress. I also think this matters because most people don't actually need more pressure. They already know what they should be doing. They've watched enough videos, downloaded enough apps, saved enough routines, and made enough plans. Information usually isn't the problem. The problem is turning that intention into something sustainable. And sustainability rarely comes from intensity alone. It comes from self-awareness, adjustment, and consistency that fits real life. That's the part most apps don't really solve. They might help you organize your goals, but they don't always help you stay connected to them in a meaningful way. And when that connection disappears, the system becomes easier to abandon. That's why some apps feel exciting in the first week and invisible by the third. They were never really integrated into how you think. They were just another layer of pressure sitting on top of your life. Modigrad feels different to me because it seems more aligned with the inner side of progress. Not just the visible output, but the actual process. The emotional side, the behavioral side, the pattern recognition side. The part where you start noticing what keeps repeating, what supports you, what pulls you off track, and how your habits connect to the rest of your life. That's why I don't think of it as just another habit tracker. It feels more like a system for self-awareness that happens to support habits, consistency, and structure in a more thoughtful way. And I think that's exactly why it stands out. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to become someone who is constantly measuring everything. The goal is to become someone who understands themselves well enough to build better rhythms, make better adjustments, and keep moving in a way that actually lasts. That's a very different philosophy from just chasing perfect streaks or ideal routines. For me, that's what makes a productivity tool actually valuable. Not how many features it throws at you, not how intense it makes you feel, not how impressive it looks on day one. What matters is whether it still feels useful when motivation drops, life gets messy, and consistency becomes harder. That's the real test. And personally, I think Modigrad passes that test in a much more thoughtful way than most of the productivity apps I've tried. That's why it stands out to me. It feels calmer, smarter, more reflective, and a lot more human. And for me, that makes it far more worth using over time.